All right, welcome back to another episode of our Flourishing podcast.
Very
Before,
excited to be
yes,
doing another one.
yeah, it should be good. Before we begin, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land, the Gunnakanai, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging.
Yeah, and I think it's important too for us, I guess, to take a few moments to consider the Closing the Gap report that was just released,
Mm,
which showed that there's just clearly so much work to do and that we're not really making serious progress in that space,
yep,
and that it requires a lot more than just, will and desire. It actually requires some action. So
yep,
just a reminder for people to keep that in mind as they
yes,
go about their daily business. What can they be potentially doing that could influence our First Peoples to feel valued as our First Peoples whenever we potentially interact with either them or even just conversations we have around
yep,
topics that are about them
hmm
and some of the challenges and struggles they face.
definitely. Excellent. Thank you for that.
Cool.
All right, so today we are going to start talking about mindfulness. So this is part one of a
Yes.
part three series we're going to do, and this topic for this particular podcast is East meets West.
Cool.
So before we get into that, though, I'm just wondering if there's any news of the week in the world of positive psychology, neuroscience, anything that's going on
Ah,
that
yeah. News
may
of the
be of
week.
interest to you.
One of the things that one of my heroes, Todd Cashton, did this week was he published um, a tweet as well as some posts on other social media about some papers of his from the past that he's gone back and reflected upon and looked at. I guess the veracity of his methodology, not just the actual results from those
Mm,
papers, and he's quite happy to come out and say, "Do you know what? Please don't pay attention to these particular
Yep.
papers because I actually don't think they're all that good."
Yep.
um, and there's two things that I really love about that. One is his ability to be able to very honestly come out and say that, and potentially, put himself at risk of criticism around things that he's published previously. But also the really important part of science, which is that just because we've been able to establish something at a point in time, doesn't necessarily mean it holds true forever,
No.
or it holds true in all circumstances.
Yep.
And the second part that I think is really important for me is him laying down that challenge to the rest of the scientific community that says, don't get defensive about your science when it's criticized. Actually, have the kahunas to go back and go, actually, do you know what? Yeah, you're right. That bit of science isn't kind of quite as strong as I thought it was.
Okay.
Or the world's changed and maybe now it's not as relevant as it potentially was, and encourage people to perhaps put less of their faith and emphasis on a particular paper that
Mm,
they've held dear or potentially cited previously.
yeah.
And I just think it's a really important part of um, the science being robust well into the future. And I wish more people would do it. And I love the fact that Todd puts himself out there time and time again
Yep.
in a way of demonstrating what lots of other researchers and scientists should do.
Yeah, cool. I actually saw that tweet as well that he where he talked about that, and I saw a couple of people come back to him and kind of like, like they seemed shocked and were kind of a bit defensive as well. So it was pretty interesting to see that reaction already. So
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. And
yeah,
I suppose it's in a climate where there is a bit of scrutiny around research methodologies. I mean,
yeah,
we talked a little bit about that previously,
yeah,
but at the moment, there's a fair bit of conversation going on about whether people should pre-publish their hypotheses,
hmm,
the replication argument, which has been in place for a long time and isn't going to go anywhere
yeah,
in a hurry, effect sizes, sample sizes, all of those sorts of
yeah,
things. Yeah,
definitely. Cool. All right. Well, let's get stuck in then this week.
great.
So let's just start off with the history of mindfulness and so where its roots are and contemplative practice, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. This is probably one of the most interesting aspects for me around the rapid take up of the concept of mindfulness in the Western world,
Yeah.
because there is at times a reluctance to accept its roots,
Hmm.
and part of that is a bit of not a myth, but a misconception that all contemplative practice is connected to religion or religious practice.
Yep.
But contemplative practice is actually less religious than one would probably first
Okay.
anticipate that it is. So, contemplative practice started in the East, and that's just the reality of where it began. So, of course, a lot of our Buddhist and Hindu traditions, and Zen, and right across those Eastern
Yep.
nations. Buddhism, for example, all of Buddhism began in India, all in exactly the same spot,
Yep.
and it flourished from there in lots of different directions. But There's also contemplative practice in lots of Christian traditions as well. So contemplative practice is not something that is specific to a particular order, and I think that's one of the misconceptions is that
Okay.
if mindfulness is attached to a religion, whereas in actual fact, mindfulness is in fact a working with the mind, and it just so happens that the legends of the practice and the originators of the practice um, belong to what would be considered a faith
Okay.
tradition.
Yep.
And so I think that's where the lines have
Right.
actually been blurred. Whereas most Eastern contemplative traditions, and certainly Buddhism, it's what we call a non-theistic
Yeah.
religion because there is actually no deity.
Mm.
And so the
Which was something
practice,
that I actually didn't realize until we were chatting about it like a month or so ago. I
yeah,
just didn't realize that the Buddha actually isn't a deity.
not at all.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
yeah,
just a
the
human.
more I learn about it, it's
That's
just really
right.
interesting
A
that
human being,
yeah,
simple like you and I, who has managed to work with their mind to elevate, if you like, the capacity of their mind well above what you and I are capable of doing,
yeah,
which is where that term enlightened becomes. Enlightenment is that ability to raise your level of
yep,
consciousness by working with the capacity of your mind. So it is actually a practice all in itself, and it doesn't actually require any kind of spiritual connection.
mhm,
However, there are elements in the practice of mindfulness and the elements that actually make it work that are around our motivation of being a good human being, our motivation about caring for others, our motivation for, um, you know, really having a focus on the well-being of others.
yep,
And so there's definitely a crossover with those concepts and what you would find in probably most religious philosophies around love thy neighbor
yeah,
or do unto others. All of those things that we're really quite familiar with. There's lots of crossover, but that's not the actual root of the practice itself.
okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Um, all right, so that sort of covers off the history of it then.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
kind of very briefly
yeah.
and sort of a
I'm
little.
sure there's much more to it than that, but yeah, yeah,
Exactly, it's complex, I guess, in as terms of well, what's happened since then,
yeah,
in terms of contemplative practice. But if you want to just go back to where does it start? Well, it starts all the way back there, and
yeah,
that's where all contemplative practice has begun. And that's not to say that somebody's contemplative practice is right or wrong, but there's no point in trying to deny or not acknowledge and recognize where it came from.
mhm,
Both from I guess, from an ethical perspective, I guess, why would you want to not give credit to um, where something has originated from and how it's been developed? But secondly, and we'll talk about this obviously further, the risk is that you then remove elements, some of the core elements as to why it works.
yeah, okay,
They actually come out of the practice in
yeah,
order to make it not look like its origins.
yeah,
And that's actually, for me, the important thing because that means that we're potentially teaching people practices that are not, in fact, providing them with any sustainable benefit.
okay, okay. Um, I guess that's a good sort of segue into the efficacy of mindfulness and
Yep.
that overall benefit and the well-being, the increased well-being that you can have from it. Just hope you can go into a bit of detail about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, if we if we talk about the benefits of mindfulness practice before we've had the ability through neuroscience and measuring techniques to understand it in a Western scientific perspective,
Yep.
um, the piece around its efficacy comes from the ability of us to have a mind that remains calm through difficulty, so that we still experience struggle, we still experience negative emotions, but we experience them in a way um, that doesn't get in the way of our ability to lead the type of life or interact in the type of way that we want,
Okay.
which sounds, suspiciously like emotional intelligence. No suspicion at all, because that's really, in fact,
Yeah.
kind of almost, you could almost say, the origins of the concept.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Um, but that's really what it's about, the capacity of our mind to remain calm
Yeah.
whilst all of those things go on around us. So that's one element. The
Okay.
second element is at the heart of our well-being is what causes us to not have well-being. Some of that's external,
Hmm.
but then it's attached to how we respond from an internal perspective.
Yeah.
And then the second part of it is a lot of our suffering is actually caused by internal stimulus,
Yeah.
not external stimulus. And those are things like our negative thoughts and potentially negative self talk and self doubt and lack
Yeah.
of confidence and all of those things that many of us are familiar with. And mindfulness gives us the ability to be able to experience those with a mind that is stable,
Okay.
if you like, in
Yeah.
simple terms.
Yeah. Is that kind of like self-regulating in a way, or is it a bit different to that?
It incorporates
Yeah.
part of self-regulation, but in actual fact, it's almost like a proactive form of self-regulation,
Okay.
so that my mind and a couple of the terms that people may well be familiar with that are used in a more traditional way. We have monkey mind, which is when our mind is leaping around all over the place. We have no control over it.
Yeah.
We're trying to concentrate on one thing, but other things keep popping up. We would really not like to concentrate on the fact that something's annoying, but we just can't help it, all of those sorts of things, and we call that monkey mind because you
Yeah.
want to imagine lots of little naughty monkeys diving around all over the place and doing their own thing.
Yeah.
And then what we're really trying to do is create a mind like water. And the reason that that's the analogy that's used is because we get the capacity to create. Imagine a lake, and the top of the water is calm. Okay.
Yep.
Now, if you throw a tiny little pebble into a lake, the amount of disturbance on the level of the water should be really small.
Yep.
And of course it is, because you get a tiny little plop, and yes, you get some ripples, but it very easily and very quickly
Kind of
evens out.
yeah, okay.
Right. However, what I'll often do when I'm using this as a description is say to people, have you ever had a pebble pop into the lake and you've ended up with a tsunami?
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah.
So a mind like water is the fact that we get our mind to the fact that the stimulus the mind responds to the stimulus in an adequate way,
Yeah, okay.
so that we don't have a tiny little thing
Yeah.
pop up and have such a big disruption
Yeah,
to the stability
and
and
have that disruption
calmness.
then kind of bring yourself back. It's sort of like you're already yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
So we manage the size of the disruption,
Yeah.
but we also recover from whatever that disruption is so much faster back to mind like water.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. That's interesting. I
Yeah.
like it. So we've spoken about this a little bit,
Yep.
and with certain Western practices, right?
Yep.
The efficacy of those compared to Eastern
Yeah.
contemplative practices.
Absolutely.
Can you talk about that a little bit and sort of
Yeah.
what the differences are in terms of their efficacy? Yeah.
Absolutely. So when we look at efficacy, what we've then been able to do with modern science, becoming very interested in what mindfulness actually does, and the kind of the irony there is, His Holiness the Dalai Lama funds the large percentage of science that's being done around the neuroscience measurements of mindfulness
Okay.
practice,
Yeah.
because what he very sincerely believes is that contemplative practice has a lot to learn from Western science measurement,
Yep.
because they didn't obviously have the ability to be able to do an objective third party um, analysis of what was actually happening.
Yep.
And Western science has an enormous amount to learn from contemplative tradition, which doesn't include objective evaluation. It includes the first person evaluation.
Mm.
Okay.
Yep.
Now, from a Western science perspective, that's problematic because in Western science, we believe that it has to be independently measured in order to
Yeah.
be veracious. But the reality is, there is documented evidence over thousands of years, more documented evidence than we would consider in a Western scientific way of being valid. Way more. It would kick pants over every scientific experiment we've ever done using Western scientific methods to demonstrate the efficacy of what actually happens when we practice mindfulness.
Hmm.
So, what's fantastic is that now that we've got those two parts of the science meeting, they're now starting to be able to demonstrate under Western scientific measurement some of the stuff that's been documented for thousands of years, which
Yeah.
is really cool. And one of the phrases that the Dalai Lama's used in a lot of his public talks is that if Western science uncovers something that I believe to be true and it turns out it's not, I'll put it down. I
Yeah.
won't carry it forward. He giggles because every single time a study gets released, it just confirms what his tradition has known for thousands of years. It
Yeah.
hasn't
Okay.
actually come up with anything new yet.
Yeah.
And so the irony of that is kind of hilarious.
Yeah.
I just think
Definitely.
it's brilliant. But what we have been able to do is do things like, we understand now that mindfulness practice has amazing physiological differences and improvements. So a lot less stress is on the body,
Hmm.
not just while we're practicing mindfulness, and this is the remarkable thing about it, but well after the practice finishes.
Yeah.
So if
Definitely.
we're doing um, like efficacious practices, and that's where we'll get to how many practices actually work and which ones are out there that don't. If we're using proper practicing, then we get benefit not just during the practice, but in fact, well after the practice.
Okay.
And so that's where I can have the ability to, let's say, reduce my heart rate or my blood pressure, not just while I'm practicing mindfulness, but I can potentially get to the stage where it will remain lower for hours after my practice, well after it's finished. So imagining that I'm, anxious about going into a medical appointment, or I'm about to sit an exam or have an interview or those sorts of things,
Yeah.
I can actually physiologically, not psychologically, actually change my physiology and put it in a state that allows me to in fact perform better in that
That is
moment.
really cool.
So physiological
Yeah.
changes. And then we've got really cool stuff like boosting immune system. So people who have a regular um, practice of mindfulness tend to have more antibodies in their blood. So we know that mindfulness practice, so just by controlling our mind, we create that ability to have less stress on all of the systems of our body. Our immune system goes up. So
Oh,
it
wow.
actually just creates a higher base level of health
Yeah.
across multiple physical systems. Yeah.
Wow. That's really interesting.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Is more
those
research being done in that space?
heaps of
Yeah.
research has been done in that space, because it starts to then unlock that link, because otherwise we end up with cliches like, think positive thoughts and, you know, but why?
Yeah.
Well, actually there's a link between creating positive experiences in our mind, which is what mindfulness in fact actually does.
Yeah.
Whether it's a sense of calm or whether we deliberately cultivate positive feelings towards others, we're going to talk about the very traditional loving kindness practice. Those sorts of things where we're actually deliberately generating those kind of wholesome emotions.
Yep.
We actually know that they then go on to have significant physical benefits for us, not just in the moment, but in the longer term.
Okay.
And that's just at the physical side without even going towards the psychological
Yeah.
benefits. Yeah.
Right. That's cool. All right. Our next little point here to talk about is one of my favorite words is McMindfulness.
Yeah.
So I don't. Is that a word that you created, or is that one that
Look,
you
I'm
came
not.
across?
I came across as
Yeah.
in a paper that somebody wrote, which was absolutely fantastic. His name escapes me at the moment, but I will come back with
Yep.
the guy's name. And it was just a great way, and I've used it ever since. I've picked it up and I use it, and it does resonate with people,
Mm.
because it's basically, if we take the essence of something, and I'll use an example completely outside of the concept of mindfulness, right? Imagine someone wanted to be an Olympic swimmer,
Yep.
right? So they actually want to be able to swim at the level that would allow them to be in medal contention at the Olympic Games.
Okay.
Okay. And most people would know that that probably takes a fair bit of rigor
Hmm.
and effort and training and all of those sorts of things, let alone skill. But, you know,
Yep.
and imagine if we said to someone, "Oh, do you know what we've created? We've created this amazing, it's just like 15 minutes a week, and you can be an Olympic swimmer, because we've cut it down into this really short version where you can get all of the benefits, but it'll only be 15 minutes of
Yeah.
effort that will be required." Now, if anyone came to you and said you could be an Olympic swimmer with 15 minutes of dedication a week, no one would believe you that that was possible.
No.
Okay. And that's exactly what we're doing with mindfulness,
Yeah. Okay.
because we want the fast version, we want the quick version.
Yeah.
Do I really have to sit for 15 minutes? Have you got a 2-minute version? Like that's the, and I'm not sure that actually everyone wants the 2-minute version, but I think that people have believed that in order to get people to engage, we need to make it
There's
quick,
that. There's
down
that.
and dirty, quick and fast, speedy. No one's going to want to put in the effort.
Yeah.
So let's see if we can make the most palatable version we possibly can. And I'm not actually sure that
Mm.
I'm not sure who drove what first.
Well, there's that idea that like our attention spans are much shorter, which
Yep.
I mean they probably are than what they were, say 20, 30 years ago or whatever, just due to the technology we've got in front of us. But like, there's nothing out there to say that people don't want to break from that, or
Oh,
yeah,
and
yeah,
there's
yeah,
enormous amounts of evidence to say that people do want to break from it. I mean,
mm,
it's one of the scourges of our daily lives now, is the fact that we can't disconnect, the
yeah.
fact that the rapid spread of information, the fact that we can't sit still. We've got an epidemic in young people who are being, diagnosed with a disorder based around their lack of ability to pay attention.
Yeah.
And a guy called B. Alan Wallace, who's a Western scientist, he's got multiple scientific degrees, but he also became an ordained monk and spent 20 years in contemplative
Oh, yeah.
practice, gave up his robes after he finished and went back into Western daily life. He would very, very strongly argue, and some of his stuff's pretty compelling, that yes, we do have an attention disaster, but it's purely because we're not teaching people how to use their minds adequately.
Yeah, okay.
So it depends which way you want to look at it.
Yeah.
But yes, we absolutely do have issues with attention. There's no question.
Mm.
We have them in workplaces every day. We have them in terms of, being able to sit around a dinner table as a family and eat a meal together without, tapping our foot under the table
Yeah.
because there's a show about to start or, you know,
Yeah.
so many things that we're being pulled towards. So I think there's a strong argument to suggest that people do want to break from it. But I guess when I come back to just, if we're actually trying to offer a solution, the solution has to actually be real. It
Yeah.
can't be, do you know what, if you just do, like, if you want, if mindfulness doesn't really suit you, it's a bit like diet. If you've got a health condition, whether it's your weight or whether it's a particular health condition, and you say to someone, in order to, you're going to need to cut down, oh, well, that doesn't really suit me. Oh, okay then. Well, don't worry about it. We'll just give you a
Yeah.
little version. You know,
Yeah.
we know that that doesn't work, but that's exactly what we're doing with
Yeah,
mindfulness
okay.
practice.
Yeah.
Um, so that's my concern around McMindfulness, because
Yeah.
it's fast food mindfulness, and we
Yeah,
know
okay.
that fast food anything in terms of our approach doesn't work, or not only doesn't work, potentially does harm.
Oh, right.
Potentially does harm.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and there's a couple of things I guess that I bring to mind for that. One is um, when people who have potentially been given what I would call mindfulness practices,
Yeah.
and they say to me, the only time I get a sense of calm is while I'm practicing. Well, that means the practice they're using is the wrong one,
Yeah,
because
okay.
the whole point of the practice is that it lasts well beyond the practice. That's what it does.
Yeah.
It changes your mind in a sustainable way
Mhm.
for the long term.
Yep.
So there's no point me just having, a nice peaceful river while I'm sitting still and no one's bothering me. If the second that I stop and I get up out of my position, my seating position, and go back into the rest of the world, the tsunami hits.
Yeah, okay.
What's the benefit?
Yep.
So now some people might argue that that relief is a benefit. Well, yes, it is, but it's also not going to the heart of.
But it's short term, right?
Oh, it's very short
Yeah.
term. Very short term.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it also then potentially creates that, well, it's not working, so I'll stop.
Yeah.
And one of the things about mindfulness practice is there is actually no end point destination other than enlightenment. Um, and you don't get that with 15 minutes a week,
Yeah.
and you don't get it with just doing it for a few months.
No way.
It's not like a 2-year gym membership and then it's all sorted.
It's a huge gym membership that you don't use. Um,
Well, there you go.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are your thoughts on the coloring in and like
Oh my
the
God. Yeah,
mandalas and
it
like
kills
those
me.
coloring in books,
It
the
kills me.
mindfulness coloring in
So,
books?
hey, is colouring in enjoyable? For those who enjoy it, they enjoy it. And
Yeah.
if it lets them have a moment of peace, great. And they get to switch off and not think about all their daily worries. Again, I'm not saying that that isn't actually beneficial to someone, but
Yeah.
just don't call it mindfulness, because it's not actually developing any type of mental capability.
Yeah.
That's what mindfulness is. Mindfulness is not checking out of the chaos. Mindfulness isn't having a break from the madness of the world or the pressures or the
Yeah.
suffering or whatever it is that's causing us difficulty. That is not mindfulness. Mindfulness is building mental capability for us to be able to develop a stable mind
Yep.
whilst all of that happens around us.
Okay.
Okay. As well as a stable mind that then doesn't contribute to what's happening around us.
Yeah, right.
So some of the internal triggers for suffering disappear when we build the mental capability to not activate those triggers.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
So by all means, do some coloring in if you enjoy it. Just don't
I do
call it,
not, but that's okay. Yeah.
yeah, just don't call it mindfulness,
Yeah.
and just don't promote it as being able to provide someone with an experience that is absolute false. It's just a
Yeah.
total
Okay.
falsehood.
Yeah.
It does not build mental capability. Is
Right.
it an enjoyable activity? Maybe for some. Not questioning that. It's not mindfulness.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting because I think like my view of mindfulness before I started like working for you and sort of reading more about it was that it was that kind of just short break from your not reality but from what's going on in the world is sort of
Yeah.
to just be calm for a moment and like it's just meditation. That was my idea of what mindfulness was, and I would imagine that a lot of people have a similar thought about, like, that. They've got that preconceived notion of that's what mindfulness is, and while that's
No question.
a very important part of it, that's not actually what the benefit of mindfulness is, like, right?
No.
It's more about being, yeah, present and yeah,
Yeah.
just being o open to
Absolutely.
what's happening and yeah,
Absolutely. And so the presence comes from the ability to pay attention.
yeah,
Okay. So this whole notion of being present, and the other part of that sort of crept into Western things is non-judgmental. Actually, mindfulness is. I'm not going to say it is judgmental, but there is definitely judgments that are made while we practice mindfulness.
okay,
Okay.
yeah,
We make judgments about the stimulus as it arises.
yeah,
That's how we build the capacity in our minds. So,
mm,
for example, if I'm practicing mindfulness and a negative thought comes up, the process is not that I'm non judgmental towards that, but what I don't do, what I learn not to do, is engage directly with that stimulus.
okay,
Because what would happen if I engage? I start thinking about it, and then I think about what if, and then I
mm,
go, well, how did it happen, and who was responsible, and what am I going to do about it, and blah, 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 blah,
yeah,
blah. And guess where I am? Completely somewhere else,
yeah,
right?
right,
But what I need to do is I absolutely need to use judgment, because what I need to be able to do is go, that's a negative thought, and that's not good for me.
yeah,
Therefore, I don't engage.
okay,
If I don't use any judgment, it means that I don't do anything with it,
mm,
which is not good if it keeps coming or if it drives me to other not so great thoughts.
yeah,
Or if, in fact, I need to make a change about that thing. So, the danger around the non judgmental piece is the fact that if, let's say, anger comes up and I just look at it non judgmentally, which is how it's often presented, just don't, no
yep,
judgment. Well, actually, if getting angry causes me to either suffer or causes me to cause someone else to suffer, I need to do something about that anger.
mm,
So therefore, for me to just go, oh no, no judgment there, it's just anger, isn't actually helpful.
yeah, okay,
So what mindfulness practice does is two things. And I think the confusion here, for anyone who's now getting a little bit nervous in their chair and feeling like they need to hold the side of their seat, the confusion here is that non judgment is being used instead of not engaging.
okay,
Because there are two factors. One is don't engage,
yeah,
stay separate from, as if you're watching it as a movie and the movie's over there and you're not in the movie.
mhm,
Okay. That's not no judgment. That's just non engagement.
yeah,
I'm staying here rather than getting on the stage and becoming one of the characters. Right.
yep,
That's the important part. That's one aspect of mindfulness that we develop is the ability of us to be able to view things as them not being us
yep,
so that we can disengage from it. And as a result of disengaging from it, we can view it differently and we can then cultivate a strategy towards that,
yep,
whether it be to try and reduce the amount of times we experience it, come up with a new way of responding to it into the future because it may continue to exist in our world.
mhm,
So I think that's actually the difference. And it's not just semantics because non judgment and non engagement are two completely different ways of being.
yeah, okay, cool, that's interesting,
It's one bit. We could
yeah,
talk for
yeah,
days. I
I
know. We could just keep going. But in terms of that specific piece, and then the second part, of course, is the reason why we're able to be present and why does mindfulness create presence is because it allows us to sustain our attention right there in that moment.
yeah, okay,
So it allows me to be fully present with you. Why? Because if I'm building my mindfulness capabilities, all of the other things that were potentially going on before I came in here and sat with you that are potentially going to happen after we finish,
mhm,
my mind, my monkeys, they're all sitting very nicely behaved
yeah,
as opposed to, "Pachoo, pachoo, pachoo, this is fun. Let's go swing off that rope."
yeah,
And I'm trying to stay here as best as I possibly can.
okay,
But the reality is, I'm thinking about 5,000 other things,
yeah, right,
emails I haven't sent, and phone calls I'm yet to make, and meetings that I haven't prepared for, and,
yeah,
which is
just all
common
that
for
stuff,
all of us.
yeah,
All the stuff,
everyone
the
experiences
stuff.
that,
Absolutely.
yeah,
So that's what being present is. Being present is building attention.
yep,
Being present isn't, oh, I get to sit here and stare at you and try not to move my eyes. No, being present is the ability of me to fully engage all of my attention right here in this moment without distraction.
okay,
We build that through mindfulness practice.
yeah. Yeah, and I imagine, like, that takes time, like, it can't just happen,
Yep.
like, super quickly, like, it's
Yep.
gotta just take so much practice.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And I'll give you a couple of very, very traditional stories that are told from a teaching perspective in contemplative practice. And, I'll declare very openly the type of Buddhism that I practice is Tibetan Buddhism. So a lot of the stories that I share with people come from that lineage.
Hmm.
Doesn't make them more or less right, but that's just where they come from.
Yep.
The first one is when a student was talking to a teacher, a Buddhist teacher, and saying how, what's the amount of what's a good amount of mindfulness to practice every day. And the teacher said, oh, I think an hour a day is just for the ordinary person, not
Yep.
a monastic person, but just an ordinary. So I think an hour is a good goal to aim for. If you
Yep.
can do an hour of mindfulness practice a day, that would definitely be of benefit. And the student said to the teacher, oh, but what about for the people who are far too busy and they can't fit in an hour? And the teacher just responded quietly, for those people, 2 hours. Because that's
Yeah.
that's the reality that we've got. If we don't stop and practice building those capacities, will continue to remain in that state
Yeah. Okay.
of monkeys jumping around, misbehaving, never being able to disconnect, never being able to stop, the ability to not be truly present with people when we need to be.
Yeah. Okay.
That won't go anywhere. If we can't do an hour's practice, we probably need to do two. So I love that. It's
I
a
love
great
that. That's
story.
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fabulous
That kind of
story.
puts it into perspective as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of
Like
does.
what you need to like. Yeah. Not that
Yeah.
there's a
There is no
prescribed hour, but
no, and it's not the
prescribed time.
concept
I
of the
mean,
hour. That's
yeah.
exactly right. But
Yeah.
the reality is if we're going to try and sell people an outcome off a 2-minute quick fix or just do the short version,
Yeah.
we're not doing people justice. We're actually doing a disservice to people by trying to convince them that that's actually going to be beneficial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the first story. There was a second one I was going to tell you, but I can't remember what it is now. Where were we up to?
Uh. Yeah. Just
That's okay.
that was
It'll
all right.
come to me,
Yeah.
and I'll share it with you if I
All
need to.
good. All right. So the next point here, we've talked about mindfulness a bit and
Yep.
kind of segued off from that. Um, I guess some detail about Western mindfulness. We have talked about that a little bit
Yeah.
already, but kind of some reference practices and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So the one that's probably most familiar to people is the mindfulness based stress reduction, the MBTR um, practice that's become quite common.
Hmm.
And it's also a practice that's been used in lots of Western studies around mindfulness.
Okay.
Okay. And again, whilst I'll be careful about how I present what I'm about to present, I'll also acknowledge that it will, be less than palatable for some people.
Okay.
Um, Barbara Fredrickson, who people will, for those who know her from Positivity and Love 2.0,
Yep.
and she's been a positive emotions researcher.
Hmm.
She's not a positive psychology researcher. She's a positive emotions researcher. That's what she's done and continues to do. She was the very first, if you like, Western scientist to use a traditional contemplative practice
Okay.
in a mindfulness study.
Yep.
Okay. So everyone else has used the MBTR, the mindfulness based stress, MB stress reduction, MBSR um, practice, which is a quite cut down version.
Okay.
Okay. And the reason it's a cut down version is because what it's removed largely is that motivation piece that I spoke about earlier, which is mindfulness absolutely builds mental capacity, but it builds mental capacity that sits on a stable motivation platform around goodness and a desire for the well-being of others. Now, if you take the desire and the well-being of others out and the goodness motivation piece, and you just build mental capacity, you will in fact enhance those mental capacities, no question, but you won't develop any more of an ethical or honorable motivation
Yeah.
that it sits upon.
Hmm.
Okay. And so people are finding that, yes, potentially they can be more present in a meeting, but not necessarily be a decent human being while they're ripping someone to shreds in front of their colleagues.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But they are very present and they're thinking very quickly. Their memory is far superior to anybody else's. They can reference lots of things on the spot. They can do lots of mental capabilities that we know get enhanced through the practice of mindfulness, but it has no reference point to why am I doing what I'm about to do? What's the purpose behind
Okay.
what I'm doing? Why am I building these capabilities? And so, what another one of my heroes, Matu Ricard, who is a French Tibetan Buddhist monk, however you put all of that in a sentence, Um, he says that Western mindfulness practice is developing mindful snipers, and that's how he puts it. So basically, you've got a sniper whose job is to kill people from long range, and through Western mindfulness practice that isn't actually cultivating a kind heart at the same time, sharp mind, kind heart,
Yep.
then yes, they can probably require less bullets. Do they have better accuracy? Absolutely, they do. Can they sustain their attention for the hours that it takes to wait for their target to come online? Yes, they can. And he says, you think about all of the things that in a sniper's practice will be enhanced by the mindfulness practice,
Yeah.
but at no stage have we developed a kind heart. And so, mindful snipers, I find that really
I
quite a
like that.
powerful description. Yeah,
Mindful snipers.
mindful snipers. Yeah.
Yeah.
And is that really what we want? Do we want people with less than honourable intentions to be better at what they do?
Yeah.
And that's
Well, I
ultimately,
mean, no.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's, hey, it's a big piece. I get it.
Yeah.
That's why, you know. So and I guess that's the key, is that I'm not saying that the mindfulness practice turns people into not nice people, but if we don't work on the elements of us that stop us being at our best, the things that are barriers to being at our best, if the mindfulness practices we're using aren't addressing those, it just means that we're better at those things that don't bring out our best.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so we only get half the job done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right? So that's the challenge.
Yeah.
Now, Barbara Fredrickson used the traditional loving kindness mindfulness practice and used it in its actual. She didn't mess about with it. It was the actual traditional practice
Yeah.
of the loving kindness meditation.
And
And
we
the
actually have that on the app as well.
yeah,
Oh, in the platform. Sorry.
yeah, we
Yep.
do. You're
Yep.
right. It is one of the practices that I've recorded. That's available for people to use
For
as
free.
often as they
Yep.
like for free. Correct. So what she was able to do, and for those interested in expanding their knowledge around this particular research, the book that she released, Love 2.0, is basically a very person's way of looking at that particular research.
Yeah.
Was the physiological effects on the vagus nerve, which is the main nerve that connects our major organs, and our vagal tone, as it's called, is how we measure how well a person can reset those systems down to baseline
Okay.
after disruption,
Yep.
after upset, after when our blood pressure spikes and our heart rate goes up and we have difficulty or trauma or pain or all of those sorts of things,
Yep.
stress. And the people who participated in the loving kindness mindfulness practice, as compared with the control group and with the group that was given another different practice to do, which wasn't a traditional contemplative practice, they had a stronger vagal tone, not just at the end of the um, research period of time, but 12 months post the end of the
Oh,
research, they still held most of the improvement that they'd gained during the research
that's
period
really cool.
12 months later.
Yeah.
And what we're actually finding is been a couple of preliminary papers released, which demonstrate that the effects of some of the research that was done using the more common cut down version that's been used in a lot of research, the results are real for the period of time, but they don't sustain beyond about 3 months after
Yeah.
the research finishes.
Okay.
And that's the difference. Mindfulness practice is meant to be transformational. It's not meant to be just 5 minutes of bliss away from all my troubles.
Yeah.
It's meant to be sustainable. It's meant to actually change things for the better
Yeah. Do so much
for the
more.
long term.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just do so much more than kind of what we're led to believe, I think, from a Western perspective
Yeah.
anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I really congratulate Barbara Fredrickson for stepping outside of what's become the
Yeah.
research norm in terms of using
And
a
that's
cut down
relatively new
version.
research, isn't it?
Yeah,
Because
it's
I believe that
only,
book was published in like 2012 or
yeah, correct.
2013.
Yep,
So it's like it's pretty new.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're talking within the last five years,
It
which
seems odd that it's taken the Western scientific world or community to kind of take the Eastern contemplative stuff on board. or are there researchers before that, like Ricard? You had mentioned
So Matu Ricard is,
Matthieu Ricard,
yeah.
yeah.
So he participates in a lot of the neuroscience research that happens. So Richard Davidson is another researcher that people might be really familiar with.
Okay.
And the difference between him and when I'm talking about Barbara Fredrickson using a mindfulness practice, I'm talking about researchers who are trying to say, if you do this practice for this long, what results do we see?
Okay.
Right. What Richard Davidson does, which is really quite remarkable, and a lot of his stuff is in the early stages, and he admits that, so he doesn't go, this is blanket
Yeah.
absolute. But what he's able to show is what's the difference between both the structure of the brain of an Olympic mindfulness practitioner,
Hmm.
as in someone who's got more than 50,000 hours of sitting practice.
Yep.
So we're talking about monastic people. We're
Yeah.
talking about people who spend multiple hours every day. It's their lifestyle of
Yep.
training their mind. That's what they do. What's the difference in the structure of those people's brains versus you and me,
Yep.
just ordinary Joe Blows off the street, to see what are the actual differences that they're creating. But then also looking at capability and capacity. So what does it appear that those people seem to be able to do compared to what you and I can manage
Okay.
in a whole different range of ways.
Yeah.
Very early stages and no evidence of causation, but there is a distinct difference between the brain of someone who practices mindfulness and the brain of someone who doesn't.
Yeah. Okay.
That's obvious.
Yeah.
As to why, how, we're
That's
a
a
long way from being able to actually
very big
name
unknown,
that.
but there is a difference though.
There's an absolute difference.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool.
Absolute difference. No question.
You just mentioned like a monastic
Yeah.
person that
Yes. So we're talking monastic means someone who lives like a monastic lifestyle is
yeah.
like a monk or a nun.
Yeah.
Someone who's ordained and
Okay.
has that practice every day.
How like in for a Tibetan monk,
Yep.
how many hours a day do you think a Tibetan monk would practice mindfulness or do contemplative practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So depending on what kinds of practice they're doing at particular
Yeah.
times. So some monastics will go into a period of retreat
Mhm.
for, let's say, 3 years at a time,
Okay.
and they would literally be sitting in a state of mindfulness practice for kind of 8 to 10 hours a day for 3 years.
My mouth's open by the way right now. That's just a long time.
Yep. And so those are periods of time that they would dedicate to that.
Yeah.
If they were studying whilst they're doing their monastic practice, they're probably doing an absolute minimum 4 hours would be the lowest that they would go.
Okay.
But it'd be more around that sort of 4 to 6 hours of practice with periods of study
Mhm.
and, of course, eating and those sorts of things
Yeah.
in between.
Just
So
normal human
it
stuff. Yeah.
varies, but you would imagine, even if you wanted to just average it out, it would be between 4 and 6 hours a day
Wow.
of contemplative sitting
Yeah.
practice. Yep.
So someone like the Dalai Lama, do you think that he would would he find the time to do that?
Yeah,
Do you
he
think
does.
with
So he
how
gets up at he
because he'd be
gets
crazy busy.
he is crazy busy, but he also is I'm not going to get this exactly right, but
Yeah.
you will find reference to it in a lot of places if you have a look because he's been quite open and honest about what his practice looks like.
Yeah.
So he usually rises at 4 a.m. every day,
Mhm.
and
That's so early.
yeah, and he will do between 1.5 and 2 hours practice at the start of the day.
Okay.
Then he pauses for breakfast and has breakfast, and as he says, he watches BBC World
Yeah.
news because he wants to keep up on what's kind of happening for
Love
the
it.
day.
Cool.
Then once he finishes breakfast, he goes back and does another 2 hours of practice.
Okay.
So there's your 4 hours already, and
Yeah.
all we've done is had breakfast. All right.
Yeah.
Then he will be briefed by his administration
Mhm.
around any business that requires his attention because he obviously is very busy and does
Yeah.
lots of things. He then has another period of practice, and then will sometimes entertain a guest, or he'll be required to do an interview or those
Yeah.
sorts of things when he's not traveling. So that's pretty much his. After he only eats lunch, he doesn't eat an evening meal, which is quite common in monastic lifestyles.
Okay.
It's one of what we call the precepts of a monastic is
Mhm.
not to eat an evening meal. So they have their breakfast and their lunch,
They do
a main
fasting.
meal at lunch, and then they don't have an evening meal.
That's interesting. I want to go
Um,
back to that point after you finish
yeah,
this thought.
sure.
Yep.
And then he would go. He would probably be in bed by kind of 8 at the very latest. So,
Okay.
up with the sun, down with the sun kind
Yeah.
of lifestyle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yep.
The thought that I just had, I'm
Yeah.
sorry that
Yeah.
I said that,
Cool.
was, yeah, so he eats breakfast and then lunch and
Yep.
then and that's really common across Tibetan
Across
monks,
monastic lifestyles,
monastic
because a
lifestyles. Okay.
precept is like it's not a rule, because it's not rule based, but it's like you decide to take a vow, if you like,
Yeah.
and that and in certainly in Tibetan tradition, they're called precepts. They may be called that in other traditions as well. So I'm
Okay.
not saying it's exclusive. And depending on the type of practice that you're doing at any particular time, you would take a set of precepts that are specific to that practice.
Okay.
And so it's a very base level precept that you would eat 2 meals a day.
Yep.
And if you go into retreat with monastics who are taking that precept and you get to the lunchtime, they always go first. And the pure reason is because there's a deadline cutoff. They've got to eat by 12.
Okay.
So the community realizes that whoever's taken their precepts, because lay people can take precepts while they're on retreat as well.
Yeah.
So whoever's taken their precepts gets served
Goes
first to make sure they can meet that deadline of their
Ah,
meal, and then everyone else can just eat whenever they want.
that's interesting. Well,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's a quite. Well, I've seen it quite a lot over the past probably year or so. Is I cannot think of what the word is right now. It's when you fast. It starts with T. What is it? Can't remember the word. It's completely slipped my mind. But
Okay.
it's basically this idea of fasting that you don't eat breakfast and that you
Ah,
fast between. Sorry, yeah, you fast from 8 p.m. until 12 p.m.
okay.
or if you could do from 10 p.m. to 2 p.m.
Okay.
And I cannot for the life of me think of what it's called in the fitness world,
Yep.
but it's this really big thing that a lot of people are like
Yeah.
going to, and I am quite sure now that it has sort of
Oh,
Eastern,
historical
it's
roots.
got Eastern or just historical roots
Oh,
in
it
that.
will, and that's where
Yeah,
the
that's what made me think of it. It's sort of the same
oh,
thing with
absolutely,
mindfulness, is it?
absolutely. And one
Yeah.
of the precepts you can take from a practice perspective is that you then, so if you have your breakfast and lunch,
Hmm.
and then you take a vow of silence until you have your next meal. So you can add that in as well, so that you then don't speak for the whole rest of that
Yeah.
day until after you complete your breakfast, and then you would release that sort of precept, or you would keep it going. So you would only sort of interact with others
Yeah.
out loud. So there's a whole bunch of different practices for different reasons, but not not just customary, because the practices actually contribute to either cultivating particular states of mind,
Hmm.
building mental capacity.
Yeah.
So they're not just not necessarily just customary. Yes, there are plenty of customs. There's trumpet blowing and there's wearing funny hats and all that kind of stuff. There's all
Yeah.
of that. But a lot of those lifestyle um, adjustments that are based around the precepts are actually all about mindfulness practice.
Right.
That's what they're for,
Okay.
and that's why they provide both physiological and psychological benefits.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, that was a bit of a segue, but thank you for that.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, we've covered off loving kindness research, so
Yep.
by Fredrickson. So yeah, I think that's probably about it for. Unless there's anything else you wanted to cover,
Oh,
I mean, I'm sure there's so much more we could talk about, but
so much more,
I think
but
it's
I think
nice,
that's a good start.
nice introduction for this,
Absolutely.
this
And of course,
3-part series.
anything that I've raised that causes concern for people, we'd love them
Yeah,
to interact and come back with questions or comments.
yeah,
I'm aware that the landscape around mindfulness in the West is problematic,
yeah,
and I'm one of the fewer people who's prepared to kind of call it out and talk about it as it is. But at the same time, very happy to engage if any of the comments that I make cause anyone
yeah.
some concern.
Hit her up on Twitter. It's at Mel Neil. All right. So our next episode is actually going to be on what is mindfulness. We have covered off some of that now, but we'll
Absolutely.
go into a bit more detail about that as well. Thank you very much for listening. And just a reminder, as we mentioned before, you can sign up to the Mind Insurance Happiness Lab platform. You can do it for free in the Happy login, and you can have access to our mindfulness practices that are there. We've got a few more hopefully coming up soon. I think there's about 9 or 10 on there at the moment, but
Yep.
yeah, they're really good. So enjoy.
Fantastic.
Thank
And
you.
please keep thinking about what are the elements that bring out your best,
Yep.
and how can you get in touch with those more often.
Yep. Awesome. All right. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
na